Good evening.
You kind of felt like you were going to go into a Good Morning Vietnam.
I know. Good morning, Vietnam.
You gotta really be able to pull that off, though. You know, you gotta go in full time.
25 episodes in, and I'm still trying to figure out how to start
the thing. Yeah,
Garrick, it's good to see you, buddy. How you doing?
It's good to see you as well.
Yeah,
always a pleasure.
It is. You know, we have snow on the ground in here in the northern confines of Sweden.
I bet
it's come.
A ton of snow.
You had a ton of snow? Oh, in the mountains. Yeah. Well, you guys.
Right outside. Yeah, 30 minutes away. They got like 60 centimeters.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, it's gonna be good skiing.
Are you going skiing?
If they let us go skiing. Right now, they will not let us go skiing.
Well,
can't leave.
I hope it opens up for your sake.
Yeah, me too.
Hey, well, we shouldn't waste any time. We have I feel like we've been hitting home runs lately with our guests. Our guest today is no exception to that rule, although now I've put pressure on him and I hope he doesn't resent me for that. Randy David Newman, not to be confused with Randy Newman, the songwriter. He has promised he will not sing for us, and I'm happy for that. Randy has a PhD in intercultural studies from Trinity Theological Seminary. He is a teaching fellow at the C.S. Lewis Institute, as well as an adjunct professor at various seminaries the world over, or continental United States. I'm not exactly sure. Anyway, great guy. I got to know him during my time at some conferences in the U.S. His books, he's written many books on evangelism, or I guess 3 books. Is that right, Randy?
I think it's 5.
5 books. Okay. Well, then there's 2 out there that I haven't read, so we'll need to discuss that today. But one of the big ones that has always just really had an impact on me, and we actually use it as training for our staff here in Sweden, is one of the first books I give people when they walk off the plane. I embrace them. I say, "Welcome to Sweden," and I shove this book in their face and I say, "Read it or just get back on the plane." No, is Questioning Evangelism, which is a fantastic book. So we're excited to have you, Randy. Welcome to the Rabbit Trails podcast and the many folk out there listening. It's good to have you.
Great to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
You bet. So it's been a while since we've seen each other, and apparently you've written 3 more books that I didn't know about, or 2 more books that I didn't know about. So well done, you. Your latest book, actually, that we were talking about in the pregame here a little bit. Is or not latest book, but the book Unlikely Converts came out of your research that you did for your PhD, if I'm not correct, or if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes. Well, I interviewed over 40 people who were recent converts to hear their stories, because I wanted to research evangelism from their side of the equation. We do a lot of research from the other side, from the evangelist's perspective, or the sender of the message. But I wanted to hear from the recipients. And all my interviews were 45 minutes to an hour long. And the stories were just so moving and beautiful and powerful. And I felt like this shouldn't stay buried in a dissertation where nobody will read it. Where nobody should read it. But I wrote up the stories, and I tried to say, here are some lessons that we can learn about evangelism, that they're not like, major breakthrough, but they emphasize some things that I think a lot of thinking about evangelism doesn't usually go after.
Can you give us some of those? So I think
Sure.
The majority of our audience finds themselves in a post-Christian secular culture or context in which most people would, when you say the word Jesus, would say, don't know, don't care. So as you talked with people who are unlikely converts, what are some of the, I think, big takeaways or surprising things that you found from them?
Yeah. And I will say that I think the vast majority of the people I talked to would have similar backgrounds of, secular, apathetic at best, maybe even hostile. So, and again, my major findings were people tend to come to faith gradually rather than all at once, incrementally. People tend to come to faith communally, meaning they hear the message from a whole bunch of different spokespersons. It wasn't just one-on-one conversation. Now, usually a one-on-one conversation was sort of the centerpiece, but they also heard it and they saw it lived out in a whole wide variety of people's lives. So that was significant. And then the one that I found most intriguing, people tend to come to faith variously. And what I mean is they latch onto the gospel at a whole wide range, a whole bunch of different starting points. There are a few people who would say, I feel guilty. I wish there was some way I could be forgiven. There are some people who feel that way, but I think that's a minority. So it's just a whole wide range of people who would say something like, I don't feel very good about myself. It's kind of like a shame, but I can't put words to it. And I wish I could be different. That's different than being forgiven. Or people who say, life just doesn't make any sense. I wish somebody could explain kind of reality in a way that I could see how things fit together. Or people feel alienated from other people and from God. They can't necessarily articulate it, and there's just a whole wide range of those kind of things. And the beautiful thing that I really explored was that the gospel message is this multifaceted message. And there are a whole lot of words used in the New Testament for it. It's not just propitiation, but it's also redemption and reconciliation and adoption and all these other words. And so people latched on or began their journey, so to speak, in this whole wide range of places. Now, they had to get to the core of atonement for sins. I am guilty before a holy, righteous God. I need to be forgiven. So I'm not saying that's optional. That's really the core, but that's not always the starting place for people. And again, I just thought it was beautiful to hear these stories.
So why do you think it is then that we go into, we're so quick to go to the nucleus, as you say, of the propitiation for the sins, rather than some of those tertiary. It's funny, when you're describing this, what was coming to my head was like the picture, because it's all we see now is the picture of the coronavirus. You have these little things that are sticking out of it. It's a terrible thing to associate the gospel with.
Yeah,
but I have a sick mind.
You really do, and I have a whole new motivation to pray for you more fervently.
I appreciate that.
Can we mute him? Can we?
Just get me on it.
Well, why do we go after that? Well, because, first of all, we absolutely must. I mean, eventually we must talk about atonement for sin. We must talk about the cross as substitutionary atonement. So that's why we go after it. The other is, in church history, that's the part of the gospel, or the heart of the gospel, that has often gotten denied or removed, which leads to heresy. And so in Europe and in much of America, early 20th century, the rise of liberalism, they denied all of that. God is not a wrathful God. You don't need a blood sacrifice. And so there is this fear of that we may compromise the gospel, or we may soft sell it. So that's a very legitimate concern. But again, we have the New Testament's full-orbed teaching about the gospel from many different starting points. And we have Jesus's and Paul's examples. They didn't always start with forgiveness of sin. Now, they got to it for sure. So one of my absolute favorites, I think about Acts 14. Paul and Barnabas heal a man, and people start worshiping them and calling them Zeus and Hermes. And Paul says, stop doing this. We're just mere people like you. And you need to turn from your idolatry, basically. But then he says, God has not left himself without a witness, and he's provided rain and crops in its season, and food and joy in your hearts. That was his starting point of the gospel. You guys have delicious food. Where do you think it comes from? I just find that so beautiful.
It's very European.
Well, and And so we shouldn't be afraid to start with those kinds of starting points. But having, the firm conviction that, that's only the starting point. We have to get to the core of the message. But I just think there's a whole lot of people who, when we say, well, you can be forgiven of your sins, they're not thinking in that category, and they don't feel it. It's like, well, I don't really have anything I need to be forgiven of. God's a holy, righteous God. Well, I don't really know what you're talking about. So anyway, that was some of my favorite stuff, of hearing it in the stories, and then showing how in Scripture it validates the fact that people come from a variety of starting points.
Randy, when you start looking at those kind of entry points, you talked about community, you talked about different ways people get engaged. What in the evangelical world that many of us come from, what are we missing when we start thinking about evangelism, or why are we missing certain things? It seems like you pointed to some things that we're missing, but why? And then also, if you could share one story that really sticks out to you of someone's process, maybe that would could also help people think through exactly what that looks like.
Well, first of all, we really need a whole lot more patience. If people come to faith gradually, incrementally, if it takes time, we need to pray for God to give us patience so that we can move at the rate that He's moving in their hearts. Related to that is we don't start far back enough. This is what I learned from C.S. Lewis, and it prompted me to, I pitched this idea to a publisher about writing a book about what we can learn from C.S. Lewis about evangelism. And I really thought, okay, this is just such a wild idea. He won't go for this. And especially since I had just pitched another idea to him, and he was not interested at all. I had this idea of an evangelistic book, and the more I talked, the more I could see it on his face of like, oh, we're never publishing that book. And then he said, well, you got any other ideas? I thought, oh, that was my best idea. So I said, well, I'd love to write about what we can learn from C.S. Lewis about evangelism, especially what he did in the Narnia books, but even more pointedly in Mere Christianity. He just backed up so far to start with, how do we know right and wrong? Why is it that we do know right and wrong? When someone steals our seat or our place in line, we go, hey, wait a minute, you're not allowed to do that. There's this innate sense of right and wrong. And in Mere Christianity, which were a series of radio broadcasts 1 week apart, he went 4 or 5 weeks before he ever got anywhere near talking about the God of the Bible. And he even says so, I think it's in the 4th chapter or the 5th chapter of Mere Christianity, where he says, do not think I'm moving faster than I am. I'm still not 100 miles near the God of the Bible. He just spent a long time of how do we know anything? Why do we believe anything? Is there something inside of us that might possibly be pointing to something bigger outside of us? And so I think we need to start further back. We need to be more patient. You asked for a story. That's right. Yes, I knew there was another part to this. Oh, so I'm telling you, these stories were just so much fun. So here's one. There was this young woman who in high school, she got this idea that she really better join a whole lot of clubs because she didn't have very good grades, and she really wanted to get into a good college. And her guidance counselor told her, you really ought to get a lot of extracurricular activities. So she joined everything. She was a cheerleader, so on this team, this team, that. She was just like so crazily busy. And it worked. She got into college. And then her first year in college, she got into her first choice of college, and she gets in, and almost immediately she thinks, okay, now in 4 years, I'm going to be graduating. I need a really good resume. I better start joining things. And she joined this and joined all these clubs. She told me she joined the underwater hockey team. Like, what does that look like? Where do you watch those games from? I don't know. Anyway, she just had a million activities. She was not religious. She didn't go to church. She thinks she might have gone to church once when she was really little, but not much. And so someone on her dorm floor invited her to a Christian group, and she thought, well, that would look good on the resume too. That was really her motivation. So she goes, and she just thought it was weird. It was just really crazy. People were, closing their eyes and waiting, putting their hands in the air and singing. They sang forever. She was really annoyed. She just kept singing. And then this guy gets up and spoke for a long time, and I don't even know what he was talking about. I didn't pay attention. I mean, the whole thing was just weird. And then toward the end of the meeting, somebody else got up and made an announcement. She said, I don't even remember what it was about. It was some kind of something or other. But she read a Bible verse, and she said, this Bible verse said that Jesus said, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And she heard the word rest, and she went, there's such a thing as rest? I could rest? What in the world is that? And so she went up and talked to that person afterwards, and she signed up because she was really good at signing up for things. She signed up to join a Bible study because the person said to her, well, if you really want to find out about rest, probably ought to read the Bible, and Jesus can, help you find rest. And that was her entryway into the gospel. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that wonderful? So for her, the starting point is, I'm exhausted, and somebody is telling me that they can provide rest. And I mean, it was fascinating. And then the rest of the conversation was, I mean, it was really pretty deep. She was struggling for rest in a much, much deeper way, not just to free up her calendar. I mean, it was pretty dark or deep, and the gospel set her free.
I think actually in this moment of COVID, I'm not sure that the church, I'm worried that maybe the church isn't aware of it, but I really think that in this moment of COVID, what the church has to offer is a non-anxious presence. That there's so much anxiety around us, and not just caused by COVID, but the busyness of life, the frenzy of renown, to be honest, if you take that girl or woman as an archetype in some sense of Western secular culture, join things, advance yourself, become your own project, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And you get to that point where you kind of go, I need to slow down. I worry, though, that the church is oftentimes caught up in that same endeavor, and therefore being a non-anxious presence is something we have to learn ourselves. And so can we offer that? Because Jesus ultimately is that non-anxious presence, right? Peace is not absence of conflict. It is confidence in the midst of the chaos, or it is the absence of chaos, but yeah. He brings that. And I find that to be so true here. That a lot of people, actually both of those instances that you gave, the idea of rest or the idea of just the craziness that's going on around, and that Jesus just brings that. But the second part of that is the amount of time. And we just don't tend to think of, I think one of the things that we talk about is you need to put in evangelism, you need to put your relationships. So you need to be bold in your relationships, in that you need to start these relationships, but you're in it for the long haul. And we just often don't think in those terms, but it's amazing, because I would say the same thing that you're saying is different contacts that people have had. So things that never show up in any kind of measurement that we do or things like that. But it's things like we'll have a party, and we know that of the 50 people who come to that party, at some point during the night, someone in a corner who will be talking to someone that they've never talked to about something deep about Jesus that will be ultimately life-changing, but they may never actually talk to that person again. And then their main contact to the person that they have and everything. And so it's kind of this, it gets referred to as body evangelism or whatever else, but there is the reality that there's so much going on in a person's story, so much more than just, hey, here's the list of things you need to know. Do you believe it? Yes, or, check yes or no.
Yeah. And there's also I think you asked a question about, why why haven't we done this better, or what are we doing wrong? So I think part of the problem also is there are a number of evangelistic strategies, tools, materials that were put together at a time when people were closer to, if I could put it this way, they were closer to making a decision. The way I always illustrate it when I'm speaking, which would work a whole lot better with visually. So I realize this is an audio, but if you just picture a line with the alphabet on it from A to Z, and this is a spectrum of unbelief. So Z is a non-Christian, but they're ready to become a Christian. They understand it, they've heard it, it makes sense, they've had the questions answered. And all you would need to say to that person is, are you ready to become a Christian now? And they would go, well, yes, I was hoping somebody would ask. Okay, so that's Z. But A is way on the other side of, the most hardened, angry atheist you can imagine. All right, so A to Z, a spectrum moving from unbelief to belief, or resistance to the gospel to acceptance. There are a whole lot of tools and materials that we put together in the evangelical world at a time when a whole lot of people were already way down by letter T. Mm-hmm. So evangelism, at least in America in the 1950s and 60s, when Campus Crusade was at its starting point, but also their heyday, I think. So a whole lot of people really were at letter T. And you could say to them, would you like to know God personally? And they would go, well, yeah, that sounds great. And even if they weren't a Christian, the God that they had in mind when you asked that question was very close to the God that you believed in.
Right.
And the whole world, and especially Europe and large parts of America, especially the coasts, east and west coast, northeast, far northwest, the whole shift has been way down to the other end of the alphabet. Mm-hmm. And so if you're talking to someone who's at letter D, for example, they're not at letter T. And you say to someone at letter D, would you like to know God personally? And well, if they don't, spit in your face or laugh at you, they might say, well, which God are you talking about? And right. How do you know this? And why should I even be interested? And so a conversation of moving someone from D to E is a different conversation than moving someone from TUVWXYZ. Yeah. And we just need a whole new kind of mindset and materials and forums in which people can explore these topics, moving gradually, incrementally, kind of complexly in a way that might be frustrating for those of us who want to get them to letter Z. Come on already, let's go.
Yeah, but it's no less. We do well to remember that it's no less meaningful, and it's no less important in God's overall plan and God's overall sovereignty. We trick ourselves a lot of times into thinking that it's the last four letters that count, and so it's the people who are getting to see the letter Z or X or Y or whatever. But how many people have taken someone from a letter A all the way to Z or whatever else, or even not even just been a part of moving that along? And that ultimately is a type of evangelism that rests in God to move his people closer to him and draw them close, rather than, okay, it's my job to push people over the finish line.
Mm-hmm. I think it was something we experienced early on in Spain, where we would get a situation where you would explain the gospel to somebody, but you very quickly realize they're not rejecting Jesus. They're just rejecting the packaging or the context that we're placing the packaging in, because they're not getting the full story. And so I think that was always an early frustration of ours, of like, we're doing what we were trying to train to do, but it's at the same time, people were not necessarily rejecting the gospel. They just were rejecting the context, the location of where we were placing Jesus in front of them, or a limited picture of Jesus in some sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On the positive side, I think people are hungry for these kinds of discussions, or and maybe not the discussion of how can I know God personally right now. Who was Jesus? Did he really rise from the dead? Maybe those are not the felt needs, but they're hungry for people talking about substantive issues and willing to explore them deeply and richly. There's a lot of shallowness and diversion or distraction in our world, and by the way, I think there's good reason for that, because a lot of people think, if I really slow down and ask these difficult questions, I might find that the answer is no, life is pointless and meaningless.
Right.
There's no hope. So in that case, yeah, the more movies and music and distractions, the better. Because I don't want to pay thoughtful attention to those kind of questions, because it's only going to be depressing and despairing. But I still think people are hungry for those discussions. And if we can have those discussions, say, they don't point to emptiness and despair. They point to rich, meaningful beauty. So I wish I could give this talk more often. I've given it only a few places, but I do this talk on why does music move us so much? Mm-hmm. But why is music so powerful in every culture, in every society ever in the history of humankind? Anthropologists talk about musics, plural, but every society has some sort of form of music. And you give people just time and they're going to start banging some sticks together in a musical kind of style. They're going to find ways to sing. So why is that? And I think it points to that the world is beautiful, or it was designed or created to be beautiful. And we're longing to connect with that, and singing and making music is a way of that kind of transcendence. But again, that's a long and deep conversation, and we need to be willing to kind of hang out at the letter DEF line for a while, and show people that we want to think deeply about these things.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the music thing. I've talked to I do a talk here in Sweden called The Apologetics of Jimmy Fallon, where I take some Jimmy Fallon clips that he does with, there's a clip of him with Billy Joel, and Jimmy Fallon finds an app on an iPad, a doo-wop app. And so they doo-wop in the jungle together. And there's just incredible joy. And I just go through and basically end up at the gospel just using that clip, because it really shows we are drawn for, one, to even make the complexity of an app, right? That you have to assume that there's some kind of, complex creature out there who might have, had an impetus to make us and everything else. But at the end of the day, that we are inspired by those things. I mean, you just watch it and there's such joy in watching Jimmy Fallon and Billy Joel in this. And it's just like, wow, I just want to sit here and watch that. So it's an incredible idea that if we spend time there with people, is actually, even if you disagree, it's at least thought-provoking, right? It's at least wholesome in some sense that we're at least talking about things that are important. And it seems to me that we often shy away from that because we think, or maybe we're just not prepared for it. I don't know what it is, but I certainly agree that more time spent in the context of conversation and relationship allow for those things to be drawn out over a longer period of time. And let's say an objection comes up, then you can say, if you're in the context of that relationship, if an objection comes up and you don't know the answer to it, well, let's talk about that next time. I'll try to figure out what that is. And then that just becomes a continuing conversation rather than, I got 2 seconds to make sure that this counts. And you're going to lose it, or you're afraid that you're losing your faith or whatever else.
I've got a quick rabbit trail for you so Bono says laughter in his song, laughter is eternity if joy is real. To think about.
So,
go ahead,
Randy. So you talked a little bit about the book that you're working on, and a little bit about C.S. Lewis and kind of the argument for God and what he would, what do you think are some of the things that we can learn from Lewis today? So you mentioned that this first part about mere Christianity and things. Are there other things that in Lewis's approach, you mentioned Chronicles of Narnia and other things. Are there other things in his approach which you would say for a secular Western culture, Lewis's approach in such a way is helpful for us?
Oh, my, oh, my, oh, my. Well, first I have to say, at the risk of getting into trouble, but that's
why this podcast exists.
No, I'm sorry. I need to reword that. At the risk of getting you in trouble. So, all right. So you said something about that we shy away. We're not prepared for this. Okay. So I think about the way I was trained to do evangelism. And by the way, I was always assigned to campuses where the standard approaches just didn't work. And so I would hear reports from people who ministered in the South of the United States and the Midwest of the United States. And those places culturally are much more like the Bible Belt than East Coast big cities where I was always called to minister. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. And in Baltimore in particular, there were just whole entire massive lists of things that people said that worked really well in Alabama, and they didn't work in Baltimore.
Yeah.
So
if I had a nickel for every let's say Southerner that came through Sweden and told me how to do ministry, I wouldn't need to raise support anymore, my friend.
But by the way, that's like this crazy image of a Southerner in Sweden. And I'm just
got a lot of them, and they're wonderful people, and we've had really great experiences. I'm
only thinking of the accents. It's like, how do they even understand each other? Never mind. Sorry. So I'm so thankful. The leaders above me gave me a lot of freedom to experiment in Baltimore, and then here also in the Washington, D.C. area. So I think about some of the things. I was kind of taught that in evangelism, I did the vast majority of the talking. It was kind of a one-way conversation. And I only wanted them to answer a few little questions, but it was mostly me doing the talking. So it was a presentation. Mm-hmm. And that just didn't work. And what worked a whole lot better was much more of a conversation, a dialogue back and forth, where even they did most of the talking. So I asked a lot of questions. And so that was one that I kind of had to retool or relearn. The other is that I was trained that when people ask questions, that you saw them as annoying interruptions, and I was trained, to say, oh, that's a good question. We'll come back to that later. Well, that just doesn't work in my context. And I don't think it works very well in yours. That if people are going to raise those questions, well, then let's go after them. Those must be routes that we can take that can get to really important things.
Yeah.
And then the biggest one that I've been reworking, and this is where, to get to your question about C.S. Lewis, I was trained. The phrase I heard so many times was "keep it simple." Keep it simple. Mm-hmm. And what I started thinking and realizing and then experimenting with is, I don't think it is simple. I don't think the gospel is simple. Now, it can be expressed simply and concisely, for sure. But the Christian perspective, it's so rich and complex, not convoluted, not so, confusing. But I mean, the Bible's a really big book, and it goes after lots and lots of different topics. And you hear the same thing from a bunch of different voices. I mean, why do we need both Isaiah and Jeremiah? They kind of say the same thing, but boy, do they say it differently. Mm-hmm. And Matthew proclaims the gospel differently than John does. And what God has revealed to us in the world and in Scripture is rich and complex and multifaceted and beautiful. And rather than, at one point I remember thinking, keep it simple. Well, I can't keep it simple because it's not simple. I'd have to make it simple. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, I would probably have to distort it. I need to keep it complicated or complex or rich. And that's what Lewis did. Lewis would talk about words and how do words work, or he would talk about, emotions. And he would talk about Jesus through Aslan, but Aslan was this complex figure. I mean, the classic thing is, when one of the children asked, I think it was Mr. Beaver, is he safe? Safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he's not safe, but he's good. He's the king. And so the picture that we have of God in the scripture, it's so rich and, again, multifaceted. We even have dozens and dozens of different names for God. Mm-hmm. So I just like exploring and going after topics like words and language and love and relationships and music and art and beauty and nature. And where do these things point us, mm-hmm. rather than, well, let me just keep it simple to the details I have in this booklet. Now, maybe this is going to ruin your podcast. I don't know, but
no, you're saying things that we have that we live, and we have said. So no worries there. And from time to time, I will use the booklets that we have if I feel that it's appropriate to help us keep on topic and everything else. But most of the time, here's the way I would put it, or the way that we talk about it in Sweden. So you studied intercultural studies and you have a PhD in that. And so when I say the words intercultural studies, you have encyclopedia volumes of what that entails. I have 2 words, maybe a little bit more than that, but not much. And so I don't have a proper folder to put all the information. Or if we were to say quantum physics, none of us would be able to really place that outside of the words. And so our file in our head is really small for that. But a nuclear physicist or an astrophysicist has a massive file for that. The way I would put it is in the 1950s and up until probably the 1970s, 80s, is that when you said the word God, people had what was probably a good encyclopedia full of information. And that's why they found themselves at point T or Z or Y. They were very close to that, and they had folders to make sense of the information. But as time has gone on and as society has become more secular and we've gone away from those folders, when you say God, people go, I don't even know how to make sense of what you're saying. Mm-hmm. And I've actually had people tell me that in Sweden, mm-hmm. when you say the word Jesus, I don't know what that means. And so, well, okay, so, if we're talking about, the 4 spiritual laws, which is it is a tool, it is a creed in many ways for a purpose in order to understand a certain thing, and used in the right context is wonderful. But the problem that I run into in Sweden is not law 4, it's not law 3, it's not law 2, it's not law 1, it's word 1, God. Okay, so now that determines where the rest of this conversation is going to go. And so that's where I have to spend all my time. And I've got people that I've been tracking with for 13 years who we're still on the God conversation, but they are much closer, and we're probably filling in Jesus conversation too. So it's not like it's just like, well, we have to have these conversations before we can get there at the same time. And that to me seems to be what Lewis really did well, was he helped to create folders for God in meaningful ways. So that when a person read his stories as a child, when they encountered Christ later, they would just say, that makes a lot of sense to me, but I'm not necessarily even sure why. He was helping them to give a plausibility structure for the claims of Christ at a later date. And that's some of the genius of Lewis. But even some of his other writings, I love the way he, as you put it, he'll talk about words or music or whatever else, and he just goes down that road.
Well, so here's another aspect of that, of what we can learn from Lewis. Maybe this is my thought first, and then I'll bring in Lewis. One of the things that I think we need to do, again, a lot of my training was, here's how to express the gospel so that you're trying to persuade people to believe it because it's true. Here's why you should believe it. This is what's true about God. This is what's true about us. This is what's true about Jesus. Trying to separate truth from error. Jesus wasn't just a good teacher. He was God himself. And so all of that is very, very important. I don't want to downplay any of that at all. If anything, we need more of it. But we also want to proclaim the gospel and urge people to believe it, not only because it's true, but also because it's good, because it's desirable, because the emptiness we feel or the disorientation we feel apart from God can be alleviated, and it can be very good to have peace in the midst of a pandemic and joy even when someone dies. And what Lewis did was he went by the route of the imagination and the emotions before logic. And so in Chronicles of Narnia, you had this positive emotional feeling about Aslan before he ever showed up. It was just what people said and the way people talked about him. And so you just liked that character, whoever he was, and you felt good about it. And when you were given an image of the White Witch has made Narnia where it's always winter and never Christmas, and it's like, that's horrible.
It is horrible.
Please, somebody fix this mess. And so it engages your emotions. And so when the statues start melting or turning from stone to real animals, it was this joy and this goodness that you felt, in addition to being convinced that it was true. And so it's that weaving together of goodness and truth that we need to find a way to convey and express.
I wonder too if this has just been a challenge. Partially evangelical culture is very, American evangelical culture is very, very practical, where you get the things done, and we're moving into the realm of the spirit in some sense of mystery, of beauty, of and why maybe evangelicals, we haven't been really good at expressing these things in an artistic way. And when I say artistic, I mean in a way that is, there's mystery and there's metaphor and there's beauty. And I think of the movie Tree of Life, and which is a movie that's kind of hard to watch, but if the Christian watching it, was a powerful experience. I felt like the gospel was being communicated to me through many different ways, but it's not here it is. It's this whole beautiful package of music and dialogue and images, and it says something maybe even deeper than the four spiritual laws. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, and again, now I'm repeating myself, but there's this whole history in Western Christianity of terrible, terrible compromise and heresy, of denying the truthfulness of the gospel and replacing it with this very, very poor substitute. And so we're very concerned about falling into that trap and preaching a gospel which is no gospel at all, and preaching a liberalism that's not just a variation of Christianity, but it's a whole different religion. Yeah. And it's without the supernatural, it's without redemption. It just makes you feel good sort of for a short period of time. So we're very afraid of that kind of compromise, and rightly so. I mean, we need to be very, very cautious about that. And the number of people who have fallen off the cliff, so to speak, and gone into theological heresy, I mean, it seems like it's almost a parade, So we don't want to join that parade. And so, so we're afraid of the arts, or we're afraid of mystery, and it's that we're afraid of people thinking we're saying, oh, so you don't believe in truth either? Great. Well, so, no, we don't want to say that. But we've got to find a way that embraces all of the ways to express this. And again, I mean, Scripture is this amazing, not just example, but a model. I mean, poetry, we have imagery in the prophets, we have stories and parables. And we also have the didactic teaching of Romans. I mean, sometimes people, they jump too far. It's like, oh, we should just tell stories because Jesus told stories. Well, yeah, Jesus told stories, but he also made propositions. I mean, he made propositional statements, dogmatic, very hard statements. So let's not throw out the epistles just because we really like the Psalms. Let's embrace all of Scripture.
As we draw to a close here, Randy, are there people today writing, thinking, preaching, speaking who embody this, what's called the spirit of C.S. Lewis, in the sense of taking the wonderment in working towards the proposition or the truth? So kind of arguing, or not arguing, but I mean arguing in the sense of they're forming an argument, not combatively. Are there people who are doing that in your mind, and who are they? Because I agree that's what we need.
Yeah, I love that little phrase you just said, forming an argument. That's I got to play with that one. I like that. So we're not just.
I expect some what do you call it? Anyway, I have no funny left in me. It's too late in the evening.
You want a footnote in the book.
There you go. A footnote would be great.
If as this all does, it'll have that footnote. I'm indebted to Barrett, right? Yeah. So okay. So
who's Barrett Harkins?
Said no one ever.
Headed to my good friend. What's his name? So I hope you know about Max McLean and the Fellowship of Performing Artists, or ART.
Yes.
They do these dramatic presentations, and they just finished making a film, because it was always on stage. But with the pandemic, they had time and the ability to make a movie instead of going on stage. So I think their artistic presentations are like that. So they have this great stage production of The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis's book. So they're people. I wish I knew more. I do like a recent book, I hope you know about it, by Rebecca McLaughlin, Confronting Christianity. Now, it's pretty much arguments and logic, but she's trained in English literature and has a doctorate in English literature. So she writes in a very beautiful style, and she'll illustrate with some stories from literature and stuff. So hers is a voice that I think needs to be heard more. I wish I had more other ideas. I don't. If I think of them, I'll send you an email. But you're right. That's what we need more of. One other over there in the UK, Glenn Scrivener. Am I saying his name right? I hope so. He's a poet, but he's written a number of books, and he writes a great deal about evangelism. He's connected to the Good Book Company. He's written for them a bunch, and he talks a lot. He did a presentation at the Gospel Coalition on using the imagination and imagery in evangelism. He's a real good one. You should invite him on. I mean,
yeah,
pretty sure he's in the UK.
We'll make it happen. People jump at the opportunity to come on this podcast.
Or maybe he's in Australia. Either way, he's had to learn the same kind of things you're feeling that you need to learn. And I think he does a good job of thinking in the realm of imagination and imagery. Because, like I said, primarily he's a poet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So last question then, and we'll be done. I have two questions, but I'm only going to ask one. I'll make it easy. What gives you hope these days?
Well, against all odds, people are coming to faith. People keep exploring and keep showing up. I heard stories of people walking into churches because they found the church on Yelp. I mean, they're crazy stories. So
we had a kid today. Sorry, we had a kid who showed up for a online prayers Zoom thing. Never prayed in his life, not a Christian, but afterwards he said he was just really blessed and honored that people were sharing their needs with each other, and he could share his need. So something starting there,
That's cool.
When you asked me the findings of my research, I said people come to faith gradually, communally, variously. I also had a chapter where I talk about people come to faith supernaturally, and they always every single conversion is supernatural, but some of them display that more than others. And I mean, people come to faith against all odds. They show up to meetings because they're antagonistic and they want to ruin the meeting. They came specifically to try to prove that all Christians are idiots, and they asked questions to disturb the meeting, and yet. The fact that people were nice to them really messed them up. It's like, why are you being nice to me? I'm being a jerk. And so the thing that's encouraging is that the kingdom of God is unstoppable, and there's no obstacle or social trend or cultural movement that's too big for God. And so he draws people against all odds.
Amen.
Nicodemus showed up to Jesus at night. I mean, he didn't want to be seen. He was trying to be, secretive about it. But so things haven't changed in that department.
Well, with words of hope, may we trust in the God who rose from the dead, and that changes everything. Randy, thank you for taking your time. It's a pleasure to see you again. And where can people find you if they want to go see what you're up to these days? Where's the easiest place?
I don't know the easiest place. So I have a website called connectionpoints.us. Sometimes I blog there. The cslewisinstitute.org website has a whole bunch of my stuff and a bunch of other resources. I think those would be.
And you host the C.S. Lewis Institute podcast, is that correct? Or you're on there often?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yes, right. We have a podcast called, what do we call it? Questions That Matter. And I'm the host on that.
Very cool. Always good to remember the name of the podcast.
It is.
All right. Well, you have a great rest of the day, Garrick. Until next time, we'll talk to y'all later.
Evening. Thanks so much.